Hi, everybody. Today is Wednesday, November 27th, and Dr. Dan Steinbock is here with us. He's the author of the book called The Fall of Israel, was published this year in 2024, and it's available on Amazon. And welcome back, Dan.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah. Let's get started with what's going on right now in the West Asia, the situation between Israel and Lebanon. How do you find this ceasefire and how important is this right now? Are we heading towards some sort of permanent ceasefire?
I would seriously doubt it. I think that if one were cynical, one might say that this is a Thanksgiving gift to the Biden administration. It was timed right before that so that people can have not a guilty conscience and enjoy the food. I'm being perhaps a little bit too cynical about it, but most importantly, the important thing is that there is a ceasefire. Will it be permanent? That would be impossible to say at this juncture. I would think that it is now very much in the interest of the Netanyahu cabinet to take a breather and take some distance. And honestly, it remains to be seen whether this is a sort of a path to the peace or calm before a storm. I think that it would be naive to think that this is a pathway to the peace. It doesn't mean inevitably that it would have to end up in volatile conditions either. I think it's a step towards the right direction. And I think that the result here has been problematic to all parties concerned. I've been personally very concerned about the fact that last time when we met, I said that what happens in Gaza won't stay in Gaza. And I felt that what happens in southern Lebanon is just a prelude to the future, in that as there was not the carte blanche, but the events of Gaza, let us say, were allowed to happen. Now it's easier to copy and paste them elsewhere, as the Israeli leadership has made it very clear. And this is very dangerous. It's dangerous when it happens in the neighborhood of Israel. It's far more dangerous when it goes beyond that in the Middle East. And it could conceivably happen elsewhere, maybe in Eastern Europe. It could happen in Southeast Asia, Taiwan Straits, and so on and so forth. I think that what has happened in Gaza and what is happening in Lebanon involves too many civilians, or mainly civilians, 70% women and children and elderly. And for the best of me, I can't see how they would be strategic assets in any geopolitical or military sense.
Yeah. We had ICC arrest warrant for Netanyahu and former Defense Minister of Israel, Yoav Gallant. How do you see the importance of this decision on the part of ICC, and how did you find the reactions to this decision on their part?
Well, I think it was a surprise to those who thought that what has happened can simply be ignored. It should not be a shock to anybody. I think this is the least that should happen. Of course, it started with the personalities, the actors that played a critical role as decision makers. But we should really also think in terms of the cabinet as a whole. All those who were involved with the decisions that paved the way to and to the actual events in Gaza. It's not just the prime minister and the defense minister, others are involved. Now, having said that, I think that even though it was a surprise to many, it wasn't a surprise to those who have now followed this case since December. And these various lawsuits against the Israeli government in the name of international law. So when the International Criminal Court in The Hague now issued arrest warrants against the Prime Minister of Israel and the former defense minister, It's a situation where the Pandora's box has now been opened, and the question is what happens next. It's not entirely clear what the judges based their decision upon. Seems to be the case that it's still based on a few events, attacks on hospitals, prevention of the entry to humanitarian aid, and deliberate attacks on Palestinian civilians. UN special rapporteurs have been reporting about a massive amount of cases and incidents. My book, The Fall of Israel, lists quite a few of those. And certainly, I feel the international humanitarian law has been violated in so many ways. Now, what does it mean then, really, if you think about it? I think that what it means immediately is that for the Prime Minister Netanyahu may think twice visiting those over 120 countries that are signatories to the Rome Statute. He has to feel the fear that he might be arrested. A similar lawsuit or condemnation was given to President Putin quite a while ago. And that happened very soon after the Russian so-called special military operation in the Ukraine. This one took quite a long time compared to that, even though here we're talking about genocidal atrocities, and one wonders why. Setting that aside, it makes things a bit difficult now, the leadership in Israel. United States is not signatory of the treaty, and the Trump administration most likely will take a hostile stance towards the ICC. The Biden administration already has taken a quite negative stance, but it serves their interest. If the case is being made, and this is likely to continue in The Hague, there may be lawsuits that will challenge the Biden administration, the president, secretary of the state, and so on. So naturally, it is in their interest to say that what happened in Gaza is not a genocide, as Secretary of State Biden has said several times, and as President Biden has said. It also creates some intriguing situations in terms of the weapons embargo by additional Western countries. I mean, how is one to look, say, at the position of Germany in this regard? Now, US, as far as we know, has been responsible for maybe 70% of the military supplies to Israel. So that's certainly the most critical player. But Germany has a quite significant role as well. And then there are the minor issues or the minor players like Italy, UK, Canada, and so on and so forth. What about their leaders? Are they complicit? What is the nature of complicity here, and so on and so forth? I see maybe 2 or 3 scenarios how this might continue or what might happen next.
Yeah. In those scenarios, in your opinion, because we have some sort of division in the Western countries. You've mentioned Canada, Italy, and even in the United Kingdom, the majority of people, is not about the government. The majority of people in the recent poll in the United Kingdom show they're in favor of arresting Netanyahu if he goes to the United Kingdom. But just we had some sort of unity when it comes to the conflict in Ukraine between European countries and the United States. But for the case of Gaza, for the case of the West Asia, we have some sort of division between European countries and the United States. Because right now, most of the European countries are in favor of what ICC has issued. But the United States saying now is not, it's against our way of thinking, that we don't abide by these type of decisions. And as far as I know, just the government in Hungary is against this new decision. How do you find this division between the European countries and the United States, and how is it going to play for Netanyahu?
I think it's a very intriguing and complex situation also because in the US right now you have a transition of power. So it's not very clear who speaks in the name of whom right now. The traditional saying, who do you call when you want to call Europe, now applies to US as well, at least until the end of January. Now, if you look at the US situation, first of all, I'd like to recall the fact that this war, the Gaza war, I think has been a game changer in the sense that there is a huge gap between Americans themselves. The younger generations, when you look at them, they understand what this is all about. There's a very strong sympathy towards Palestinians. And this, I think, it's not necessarily that you are pro-Palestinian or pro-Israel. If you're pro-truth, you cannot allow a genocide under any circumstances. But there is this gap. And the administration, I think, is alienated from the younger age groups in the United States entirely. And even the older ones are divided when it comes to nitty-gritty. However, when you look at the transition from the Biden administration to the Trump administration, we'll probably see a situation to worsen from it was before. It will be even more gung-ho in terms of the Israeli interest. That's why I think that Prime Minister Netanyahu is now willing to have a ceasefire in Lebanon as well. If you look at the European case, then it gets even more interesting and more complex. We already see that the so-called unity in terms of Ukraine and Europe is cracking. Partly because most countries know that when the Trump administration will come in, most likely there will be a halt to military operations. That explains the aggressiveness on the part of Ukraine and on the part of Russia right now. If you look at the top of the EU, the foreign chief of the EU, Josep Borrell, I think that he made it very clear that it's not a question of being pro this or anti that. It is a question of abiding by the rules. And if this is the decision of the ICC, then the European Union as a whole must go with it. And my understanding, even though Josep Borrell is not exactly your best anti-colonial example, he himself gave all kinds of statements not so long ago about the role of Europe and its history. But nonetheless, in this case, I think that it's a very reasonable stance. Now, if you look at what would actually then happen under these circumstances with all this complexity, I think you have three scenarios. You have one, which would be the one that I think the US would prefer to have, delegitimation. In other words, you will either ignore or strongly criticize ICC, you will stop funding it, you will certainly try to tarnish it, and some people among the Republicans would probably like to collapse the entire ICC. I think overall, the US administration would like to keep it going, but keep it going in the name of the US interest. And this is going to be very hard when more than 120 countries are now basically going with the decision of the ICC. There's another option, but I think time may have been passed in this one, and that would be co-optation. In other words, there was a very well-known and very strong understanding within Israel that this decision might come, especially after we heard the arguments in the South African case against Israel and others thereafter. And the thinking was that if an internal Israeli investigation would have happened, would have taken off, it might have convinced the World Court to freeze the warrants, at least temporarily. Israel's own Attorney General made a big point about this not so long ago, telling the government for month after month that the best way to combat the warrants and other threats in the international legal arena would be to announce formation of National Commission of Inquiry into what actually happened October 7 and the Gaza war itself. Now the question is, why did Netanyahu government not go with it? They had a chance to contain this, of course in the wrong way, but they had a chance to do so. And actually, even the people who were presenting this argument were partly from his own party. But I think that Prime Minister Netanyahu, since he has most at stake and his own trial for bribery will start, I think, December the 2nd, very soon, he doesn't want to have this kind of an inquiry for a couple of reasons. Most important being that you will then acknowledge that something went wrong on October 7, and possibly something went wrong with the conducting the Gaza war itself. This would be manna from heaven to the Israeli opposition and to many people in the Likud, the party of Prime Minister Netanyahu. But it wouldn't be so for him or the far right who are now in his government. They don't want to have this kind of investigation. They are willing to have it when war is over, they've had their will and case closed. There's still a third option, and that's a muddle through. You won't have this, you won't have that. ICC will continue to push. Americans will do their best to ignore it, pressure Europeans a hell of a lot so that they wouldn't go with it. And we already see certain cracks in the European front. I mean, soon after this decision was made, the Hungarian government announced that it would invite Netanyahu for a visit to Budapest, even though conceivably they should abide by these rules. Now, that was signed, of course, from Prime Minister Viktor Orban that we are willing to play ball. And his political views and those of Netanyahu, to a degree, not entirely, but to a degree, there are similarities. More interesting are the cases you mentioned, which would be the United Kingdom, France, and Germany, Italy. Now, it seems to be, at least if you take them at face value, Germany United Kingdom and France stand behind the ICC decision. That remains to be tested. And I think it will be tested at some point. But then there's a question of Italy, where the political leadership also is closer to the Netanyahu cabinet, partly encompassing the far-right elements of the Italian society. And they didn't speak against this decision, but they said it would be hard to see how this might be implemented and so on and so forth. And a milder form of this kind of an argument was presented in Germany. But Germany is heading towards election. And as a result, the present leadership is sort of a lame duck position, has lame duck position, a bit like the Biden administration currently. So these three options, I think, are the relevant ones. Delegitimation, I don't believe in the collapse theory, though, or the cooptation, but I think that Israelis are late. They can't do anything any longer. If they now start a commission, it's not very believable, it's not very credible if it was anything like that in the first place. And thirdly, then this muddling through approach, which may be what we will see.
What's so amazing about Israel is that the government under Netanyahu is so much dependent on him and the way he's thinking, even with this invasion or incursion in the southern part of Lebanon. We had Golan, he was not agreeing with Netanyahu. And then at the end of the day, Netanyahu came out of this victorious, and he could change him, and he could go to the southern part of Lebanon, which was failed, as we know, as right now. One of the main reasons for this ceasefire is they couldn't achieve what they wanted to achieve. They thought that they're gonna advance so fast with those assassination, all of those, with the bombing of the ammunition of Hezbollah. They've thought that it could be much easier for them. But how do you see the role of Netanyahu in what's going on right now in Israel? Because we are talking about the far right, but the face of the far right for me, is Netanyahu, and the way that he's thinking, that he's transforming the society in Israel.
True. I think that, this is a hell of a long question, because it would take us really to look at the history of the far right, which we don't entirely have time to. But I think one could reverse what you just said, in that if the fate of the far right is Netanyahu, the fate of Netanyahu is the far right. They are now in a very strange symbiotic relationship that's uncomfortable to Netanyahu and uncomfortable, I'm sure, also to the far right. Think about it. If you look at the geopolitical aspect of the story, the primary objective of the Likud party, led by Menachem Begin, the first prime minister who took really government responsibility for Likud 1977 in Israel, the primary objective at the time was to take over Sinai or keep Sinai, keep West Bank, take over southern Lebanon up to the Litani River, which is what we have seen once again happening. And some thought even going further, in terms of going further from Jordan towards Saudi Arabia. Those objectives, I think, have been buried a long time ago. But there is this deep-seated faith into that for security reasons. Unfortunately, after the Six-Day War, all of this security ethos was then compounded by the religious ethos. Actually, we don't need these areas just for national security. God gave them to us. And this is where the far right gradually comes in, particularly the messianic far right, uh, Rabbi Cook and their disciples in Israel. These rabbis who preach basically ideas that I read and talk about in the book, The Fall of Israel, as Jewish supremacy doctrine, these ideas were basically that we are approaching the end of times. And ultimately, there will be a Temple Mount that will be Jewish, and Messiah will come, and so on and so forth. Few Israelis cared too much about this until 1967. After that, a few more started to listen because it seemed to go with the sign of times until you had the attrition war in the 1970s. Then you had the Yom Kippur War, where the triumphant image of invincibility of the Israelis was crumbling and crushed, and something else came instead. But that's where you have then this strong relationship between the US and Israel in military terms. But when I go back and think of those days, if I may very briefly, I have never forgotten, and I talk in the book about it, my meeting with Rabbi Meir Kahane. Most of the far right in Israel, particularly those who are in the cabinet, either had been in his party, Kach, which was then forbidden by the Israeli Knesset, but they have now new parties with different names that basically are pushing the same ideas that have not been forbidden. And when I met him in 1974, it took a long time to have that meeting. I came from another meeting with the Peace Now movement, where my affinities lie. But I wanted to see what kind of adversaries does peace have. And at the time, I didn't know how meaningful and how important he would be for the future Israeli far right. This was a man who was a master of hate. I don't want to demonize him, but he was unable to say the word Arab or Palestinian without a sense of condescension, without the sense of aggression or anger. And his idea was simply that this land belongs to us. We need to have voluntary transfers of Palestinians. They need to leave peacefully, and if they don't, we have to throw them out. He said it very clearly until he started diluting his message in order to get to the parliament, which he was able to pull out. And he believed that, as he said, democracy is a goy thing. Democracy is not for the Jews. Autocracy is, and even better, Jewish theocracy. So these ideas in 1974, 1975 were so absurd. At the time when I was protesting the settlements in the West Bank, to hear this sounded crazy. At the time, there were only 3,000 settlers in Gush Emunim and other settlements in the West Bank. Now there are 700,000, 800,000. And not all of them think like this, but I would say at least there's 10 to 20% hardcore believers, and many of them are violent, engaging in anti-Arab pogroms and have done so for a very long time. They should be behind prison, in the prison, behind the bars, not outside. But it's from those traditions of Jewish supremacy thinking, of violent extremism, and so on and so forth, that this kind of ideology comes from. And it gradually got stronger. You had the Jewish underground violent formations in the 1980s. People said, oh, these are lonely wolves. But they weren't. When I was researching my book, turns out that most of those people, Israelis who were behind the terrorist attacks against, say, the West Bank mayors in the 80s, they belonged to one or two or three organizations, usually the extreme far-right settler organizations, or Rabbi Meir Kahane's Kach party, or its ancillary organization, and so on and so forth. There were always these connections. People didn't recognize it until the assassination of Rabin, which happened by an extreme far-right activist who was religious in Bar-Ilan University in Israel, and who was also studying law, and who thought that he is doing a service to the nation of Israel, because there was a certain interpretation of biblical law that if you are able to preempt a person who would attack the Israelis, you are entitled to do so for religious reasons. After that, the peace process crumbles, and thereafter the far right that used to be mostly in the margins starts to march into the institutions. Its time had come. And if you look at the trajectory, the political trajectory, you will find that far-right thinking and ideas started to spread more and more into the parties that were to the right of Likud around from 2000 to 2015. And thereafter, after several wars in Gaza, they got stronger, these voices. But even then, they were in the margins. The big change really happened when Prime Minister Netanyahu opened the door to the cabinet. He invited people who had been imprisoned in Israel in the 80s and 90s. And Greer, one of the ministers, actually prided himself and was threatening the assassination of Rabin prior to the assassination itself. So these guys are now in the government. What else can you expect? But their power is not limitless. The problem is this: if Netanyahu angers the far right, meaning these parties, and they walk out, he will have probably a majority in Knesset of 1 or 2 seats. He doesn't want that. He wants to keep the far right. Far right would prefer to have a more far right government. They can't have it because most Israelis don't think that way yet. But unfortunately, demographics is working for these parties, and the anger and the hostility and the US military aid. As long as you are rewarded for what should be penalized by international law, these trends are likely to continue, I'm afraid.
Do you think that Donald Trump being in office again in Washington would help Netanyahu and his movement and his party and the way that he's thinking in Israel? Or we know in the case of Donald Trump, it's so tricky when you think about him. People are talking that he's a far right. He's not far right. He's playing to be a Republican candidate, but we know at the end of the day, the way that he's thinking, he's not connected to the Republican or Democratic Party. But at the end of the day, when you look at these people who are going to work with him in his administration, we can understand where he's where would be his destiny in terms of the policies in Israel and in the West Asia. Do you think that Donald Trump's presidency would help Netanyahu and his movement and his party?
The short answer is yes. And the long answer, I think, would have to have 2 sides. One, what happened during the Trump 1 administration? And we don't know what will happen with the Trump 2, but we do know and have an idea who will be in his administration regarding the Middle East policies. So if you look at the past and think that that might give an idea where we're going, it's not very optimistic from the point of view of the Palestinian position, and I would argue even from the point of view of the Middle East overall, not to mention the Arab League, Arab countries overall. If you think about it, when the Trump administration came to the White House in early 2017, one of the first things he did was making David M. Friedman the US ambassador to Israel. Now, ambassador usually should be a career diplomat, at least in this kind of a prestigious and very sensitive role. This was not the case here. Friedman belonged to, was a very strong Zionist supporter, but not only Zionist, but revisionist Zionist. In other words, he supported the tough line of Menachem Begin, the former head of the Irgun, a terrorist group, who then became Prime Minister of Israel in 1977. His successor, Chuck Shamir, used to be the head of one of the heads of Stern Group, also very strong extremist groups, had far right and far left within that group. They were in charge of the bombing of King David Hotel in 1947, and he became prime minister before Netanyahu. At one point, he was a mentor to Netanyahu. So these were the people where the ambassador of US that he saw as his kind of affinities, his sort of a support group, if you will. And he was also a strong supporter financially of the settlements in Israel, which are illegal by international law. But it wasn't just that. Other things happened very quickly. Netanyahu announced that Israel would lift all restrictions on settlement construction in the West Bank that still prevailed in the Obama administration. So the floodgates were open, more settlements, more and better, larger, more attacks also against the Palestinians in the West Bank. At the same time, Trump had, I believe, some doubts, and I talk about this in the book, had some doubts about the Prime Minister Netanyahu. But we do know roughly, certainly, is that when he came for his visit, he did meet Mohammed Abbas, the head of Palestinian Authority at the time. And he met first Prime Minister Netanyahu. Netanyahu showed him a tape, asked him to listen to a tape, which presumably had Abbas calling for killing of Israeli children. Now, the Secretary of State at the time, Rex Tillerson, said that this is a fake. This tape is a fake. Netanyahu has done this before. Don't take it for real. Next day, Trump meets Abbas, calls him a murderer and liar, and said that you tricked me. And thereafter, it was all free fall, in terms that the Jerusalem was made the capital of Israel, and thereby the U.S. embassy was moved from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And decades of U.S. policy towards Jerusalem was reversed basically overnight. At the same time, something even more interesting happened, and that was the first major U.S. military base comes to Israel. I remember the years from the 70s onward, the idea of an American military base in Israel was inconceivable. Israelis were very tight about their sovereignty. They had always been dependent on others, so they wanted to be sure and rely on their own hands only. Some Israelis, of course, felt that this is great, but there are no free lunches with the United States or any other major power. They come with strings attached. So if there's a missile attack, sometimes the question of life and death might be a question of 5 to 15 seconds. And those seconds will be the decisions that will be done may not happen in Israel. They may happen in Pentagon or White House. So some Israeli generals saw that as a loss of sovereignty. It's not a simple thing to happen. And then, of course, the Trump administration withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal that the Obama administration, Bush administration, and others had been negotiating for years and years. That was ended. And Trump ordered the closure of PLO office in Washington, D.C., canceled all US aid to West Bank and Gaza, and annual aid given to the UNRWA, even worse. Then it annexed the Golan Heights, which is, as I understand, a full violation with the UN Security Council Resolution 497. But the biggest thing of all probably was this, the Abraham Accords, which was an effort to unite the Gulf countries under the same umbrella, work with the United States, create a comprehensive peace. And this is as far as he got. Then he lost his second term. Biden comes in. Biden doesn't want to talk about the Abraham Accords, so he talks about normalization, but it's the same thing. Now, he could have questioned this approach to the Middle East. He could have reversed the decision on Jerusalem, simply stating that this is not according to US policy. He didn't do it. He could have reversed the decision about Golan Heights. He didn't do it. So all of these things were allowed to happen during the Trump administration and the Biden administration. And I have no doubt it would have been the same with the Harris administration, should that have happened. It probably would not have been the same with the Sanders administration, which probably will never happen exactly for that reason. But be as it may, that's the case. So if the past is guidance to the future, I don't see too much hope in terms of what's ahead. But as you mentioned, Trump is extremely unpredictable and volatile, and this will be his last term, whatever happens. And I think that in the back of his mind might be the idea of creating peace. But when he talks about it, people think, oh, peace, uniting the Israelis, Palestinians, finally permanent ceasefire, entire Middle East pacified, we can finally build prosperity and development. I'm not sure he thinks about that. I think he thinks about Saudi Arabia and other countries joining the Abraham Accords, but that will be very hard to achieve because of the Gaza war. It will be very hard for Saudi Arabia to take that sort of a step when the future of Palestine, the future of Gaza is in question. We don't know what will happen with Gaza at all. Is it even inhabitable for years or decades? So something has to be done about that. Then there's a bigger question, we can talk more about that later perhaps, which is for the Biden administration, the Grand Bargain, which is another term for Abraham Accords, means the ejection of China from the Middle East. And I'm not quite sure most Middle Eastern countries would accept that. Just like in the Southeast Asia, Latin America, and Sub-Saharan Africa, Chinese investment, I think overall has been positive. It is built on business. It is based on peace, stability, and then building prosperity. But American approach is very different. It's usually regime changes and the destabilization. And these models can't be reconciled. So what will happen next has then a lot to do with the early appointments of the Trump administration, which we are now beginning to see where they go.
I think the point you raised is so important right now because the way that everything is changing in the West Asia, in the Middle East, is so important. If the United States, if, I'm not talking about just the Biden administration, the Trump administration, which would be in office in 2025 and which would be responsible for most of the things in the future, do you think they understand what's going on in the West Asia right now? Because as you've mentioned, the picture, the relationship between these Arab countries and even with Iran and Turkey has totally changed during these years of Biden presidency. And is that going to be taken into account for the Donald Trump administration? Or they're gonna, because the way that they're talking about China right now, they have to make some sort of moves in the West Asia to achieve their goals, the goal that they have in their mind. But it doesn't seem that would be the case for the United States, as long as I know the that they don't have any sort of leverage on Israel. They didn't show it so far because in terms of the rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and the way that Turkey is just cutting all of the ties with Israel, it's unbelievable. The situation in the West Asia, it's totally different from what we've seen in the first term of Donald Trump. And right now, are they going to consider all these changes if they want to fight China? Let's assume that. Do they really consider being more closer to these countries? And they cannot make any sort of, in my opinion, attrition between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Right now, they're talking to each other. It's not perfect, but they're improving. There is no difference right now. Much more. It's all about unity. If you remember the summit in Saudi Arabia, and we had more than 60 countries participating, Sunni Shia all together. And how is it going to be considered in Trump administration or even in the remaining days of the Biden administration?
This is why I said earlier that one might look at what happens right now as a calm before the storm. Because when you have irreconcilable models coming together, it's hard to see how that can end in a very peaceful way. But looking at the matter at hand, then, first of all, if you look at the role of China, China's role in the Middle East is very different from that of the US, although people nowadays say that, oh, China has its role, the US has its role. But think about the beginning. When the US created its role, it basically owned or controlled, dominated 50% of the world economy. When China came to the Middle East, its role was still relatively minor and still is compared with the US. And it certainly doesn't have the military muscle that the US has. And it certainly doesn't have the political muscle that the US has had as the architect of the post-1945 world, which still rules, even though the environmental conditions have totally changed. That is my concern, exactly what you mentioned, because this huge contradiction between the stated reality and the actual reality. My sense is, and while in the US, I constantly talked about it, why would it be so problematic to acknowledge the multipolar world when it's economically already the reality? And it's not away from the US welfare at all. It contributes to it. If you create a clash, then obviously it will follow. if you look at the China's role, I think that particularly regarding the Middle East, the fact that it was able to negotiate or serve as an intermediary between Saudi Arabia and Iran after 7 years, was it, of hostilities, ambivalence, skepticism, criticism, and so on and so forth, was magnificent. Now, one of the major obstacles for working together had been set aside. But think about it in reverse. If you think that axis of resistance, as Iran would call it, and many Arab countries would call it, but axis of disorder, as Secretary of State uh, Blinken might call it, there's a big difference in the way Americans see this. They see it as appeasing terrorism, appeasing insurgents, and so on and so forth. There is little understanding that when you have military efforts to control people, that almost always results in insurgency, which can then be fought with counterinsurgency, which is what Western countries have done since colonialism, and it has never worked too well. It has always led to more people dying or in unwarranted wars, as I might argue. So, but this was a great achievement of China first. The second was negotiating and serving as an intermediary between these different Palestinian groups so that they could unify their front in the future negotiations. Now, take the other point of view, which really is saying we don't care about the two-state solution. Officially, we have to support it. We talked about it. We pledge in the name of it. We are not doing anything that would advance it. That would be the net effect of what we see, the reality as opposed to the official status quo. So these efforts to unify ranks by China and de-escalate seem to be contradicted by the opposite forces that have been relatively benign, if one can use even that term, until now, but that might become stronger. We should remember that it was under the Trump administration that General Soleimani was assassinated, most likely in cooperation between the US and Israel in January 2020. And this is violation of another country's sovereignty, if you will. And those attacks have happened by Israel, also in Syria and elsewhere. One would be more optimistic if the people who are now joining the coming Trump administration might be different. And one might even argue that sometimes Trump talks in ways that you might think that there is room for peace, and this is something that he might want. There is a non-interventionist streak in his thinking. One parameter would be to look at what happens to Tulsi Gabbard, one of the appointees on the intelligence side. She has been pretty much trashed by the pro-Biden administration for being a quote-unquote Russian asset and God knows what, a demon beyond pale. Whereas when you look very carefully, what she has said actually indicates, I think, a non-interventionist understanding of the world and how it works. So the question is, will her nomination, her appointment last or not when it goes to the Congress? She will face a very hostile Congress. But you look at the other names, and it's not a very good picture. For instance, Trump's choice for Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, he openly affiliates with groups that identify with Christian nationalism, is on the record saying that Zionism and Americanism are at the forefront for Western civilization and freedom. And I was somewhat apprehensive and stunned when I found out that he supports the so-called Temple Mount movement. In other words, the movement that supports the proactive building of a Jewish temple in that area, which is so important to so many religions, particularly to Islam and Christianity. That would be the prime way to cause extraordinary destabilization and pain in the Middle East. But he supports it, apparently. Then you have the new ambassador to Israel, Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee, who adheres to the Christian evangelical belief that the return of the Jews to Israel validates the biblical narrative. And he's on the record saying that there is no Palestinian nation, really. And he doesn't even recognize West Bank. This will create a very interesting situation when he will meet members, hopefully will meet members of Palestinian Authority. Either he meets goats or he meets people who are flesh and blood. And then when you look at the National Security Advisor, in the past there was Michael Flynn. He had his religious motivations, But that's very different, again, from Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who is a very gung-ho Republican, strongly against China, for the NRA, the guns, and very strongly from the Israeli position. The ambassador of the UN to the UN will be Elise Stefanik, who has excelled in congressional hearings on anti-Semitism when her strong condemnation of one of the presidents, I believe the president of the University of Pennsylvania, resigned after that award. And she was rewarded by the Adelson of Zionism Award by a wealthy Jewish donor. Special envoy to the Middle East will be Stephen Witkoff, a very strong supporter of Israel, another real estate developer from New York City, close friend of the president-elect who plays golf with him. Here you have another problem. Again, in the past, it's the diplomats that channel the US foreign policy. Career diplomats. That's the way it should be, people who actually understand what they're doing. But here you have a real estate developer who has zills experience of Middle East diplomacy or diplomacy in general, and whose stated sympathies lie only on one side, not the other at all. Most importantly, there's a bureaucratic problem. Whenever has been a Middle Eastern envoy by the president, that usually sidelines the State Department. We saw something like this with Jared Kushner, who was a special advisor to President Trump in the past and who might show up again at some point. And that has a way of simply marginalizing the State Department. I believe that Americans shouldn't be demonized at all either. There are a lot of good people who want to build peace, want to have a prosperity and decent life to most countries in the Middle East. And I think that many have more nuanced understanding, especially if they've served as diplomats, than the incoming Republican administration. And by the way, I totally share your view that I believe the Republican Party fell hostage to President Trump already before the first term. It allowed that to happen. It thought that they can control Trump, ignoring the fact that there might be a status quo where President Trump is controlling the Republicans. And I think that's where we are right now. The party has changed to beyond recognition. The old traditional, let's say, multilateral wing of even Kissinger and other Cold War realists is gone. So what is left? If you look at the ideologies of just these people that I mentioned, there are certain common denominators. One is strong sympathy, support for Israel, longtime supporters of the Israel lobby in the US. Second, there is also this very strong ethos of evangelical Zionism over evangelical Christianity, which is very odd for most Europeans who tend to be far more secular, but it's relatively strong here. And because of these 2 points, they also share the view that all you can have in the Middle East or anywhere else is a clash of civilizations. There's the West, and then there's the rest. And the rest is used as a kind of an umbrella term for everything that's not us. There's them and us. We are good, we are fighting for civilization, etc. They are bad, they can be barbarians, primitives. These are distinctions that come from the era of colonialism. And my concern is, I share your view of the potential of what might happen in the Middle East, but my concern is that when the ideology that filters what we see from the world is like this, if they travel in the Middle East, do they really see how people live and work? Do they want to see that? Will the US ambassador and other envoys, will they go to the West Bank and Gaza, meet ordinary people there? Or will they only stay on one side and be selective about that as well? Because these people that are now coming in never made a point of meeting members of Peace Now movement in Israel, but they would meet people of the Likud party. They would be trying to avoid meeting the far-right members, but they would meet the cabinet members who cooperated with far-right as well. So I would like to be more optimistic, but by nature, I like to believe in optimism, but I tend to be pessimistic when we look at what happens.
Just to wrap up this session, Dan, in my opinion, what's going on between Iran and the United States is so important for what's happening right now in the West Asia. Do you think we had the Trump administration before in their interviews, Donald Trump and his vice president, he talked about the only problem they have with Iran is the Iran nuclear program. Do you think is it going the relationship between Iran or maybe some sort of talk between Iran and the United States would help the situation in Gaza, or it doesn't matter what's going on between Iran and the United States? The situation would be the same and Israel would do whatever it wants to do.
I'm afraid that, and I have no doubt that Prime Minister Netanyahu believes in this, that there is a carte blanche now being extended to Netanyahu. But I also think that that will come with strings attached as well. And it's not just because both gentlemen are relatively narcissistic and very eager to have themselves portrayed in a certain way that advances their interest. There is a part of Trump that I don't want to ignore. I would give it a probability of 5 to 10%, where there is a desire to create some sort of a peace in the Middle East. There is also perhaps a temptation to see Iran through the lens of North Korea, only in the sense that when there was this great hostility between Pyongyang and Washington, not so many years ago, Trump used it, escalated it, to then create some sort of understanding between the United States and North Korea. He wanted to sell himself and portray himself as the ultimate deal maker. So I think that there are elements of that here as well. But will he do it when his own son-in-law tells him, oh, don't go there? Think of Gaza. If it's leveled, it would be great real estate. American companies would invest and so on and so forth. Something that Jared Kushner, to the surprise of many, said publicly in early spring this year. Would he be able to resist the temptations of his future defense secretary or his secretary of state or the ambassador that he has now in Jerusalem? I think that most likely he will do what he can to expand the Abraham Accords. But then he has to deal with the issue of China that he would like to sort of isolate into a question about trade and tariffs and so on and so forth. My concern is that he will bring back, restore, and revive the notion of maximum pressure, which basically deems that Iran has to be softened so that we can negotiate from the position of strength. And I believe that this is one of the worst possible things that he could do for a lot of reasons. One, because this is not Iran. Iran is very different from the way Iran is being portrayed by the US. It's far too dehumanized, too demonized, and so on and so forth. It would do well for a lot of American networks to do a bit more specials on Iran than they've done in Israel and elsewhere, at least to complement things a little bit and create more understanding on all sides. But would he be able to overcome these obstacles? I'm not quite sure that will happen. There will be that effort to weaken, soften Iran. The only question is how far would he go doing so? Because the more he does so, he will undermine also some preconditions for a more lasting peace. The present government in Iran is led by a reformist president. Now, he is not the key person in charge of the Iran itself. Naturally, the supreme leader Khamenei is, but his age is such that at some point he has to retire. So he's building also sort of the foundation for his successor and for the future of Iran. There are some elements that perhaps should and could and should encounter each other in a very positive sense. But my fear is that this effort to, at maximum pressure, will start. They will do it with Iran. They will also try to do it with China. And in the case of China, the idea is that China would stop buying any oil from Iran. And since Iran is very dependent on those buys, that would hurt Iran quite a lot. Uh, Obviously, China doesn't want to do that either. And if you think about the Chinese point of view, I think Americans should very much also heed to some stated facts. One of the most important ones happened maybe 6, 7 years ago when there was a question of the role of Chinese investments in Iran, which are extensive and particularly increased during the time of great trouble and great challenges in Iran. China, I believe, proved to be a kind of a friend that would be there also in bad times. And during those times, there was a lot of investment. And China made it very clear that any violation of Iranian sovereignty, attacking these infrastructural investments, would be considered to be an attack against China as well. That is quite a statement. And of course, the proof of the pudding is in the eating of it. So we'll see how this will play out. But all sides are creating these red lines, how far we will go and what will happen next. Iran also has to think a couple of things. The crisis, the present crisis, I think the Israeli point of view is that we have shown that Iran is vulnerable. And they feel that they have shown this in the sense that the axis of resistance wasn't as powerful as people thought, or that in the sense that the missiles and drones were not as devastating as people thought. And Iran so far has not seized or talked about going faster into a nuclear program. I'm afraid that this is a misinterpretation because the axis of resistance was there when it was needed. It showed its powerful force without using all of its cards. Hezbollah could have used and can still use hundreds of missiles, even when it has been weakened, likely more. And Iran, certainly a lot more, even now, after it has been weakened by the Israeli attacks. That it chose not to is something that I think if US administration was be led by presidents of the caliber of Roosevelt and others, they would understand this. It shows restraint when you don't use the weapons, the ammo that you have. Netanyahu has had to do it constantly. And then there's the other thing that I mentioned. If this war has proven something, it is a double-edged sword in the sense that most Israelis would say, Americans would say that we stand together with Israel. These are ironclad ties, which is what Biden is saying to Israel, as he's saying to Taiwan, as he is now saying to Philippines, as he said to Ukraine. But look at what happened in Ukraine. Whichever way the war ends, almost every third Ukrainian is gone. Many more have been killed, entire generation. The assets of the state of the country have been mortgaged, a lot of them to American investors, and that may not be a coincidence. There's a very bad blueprint here. Also, it is true, these attacks by Iran were contained, but Iran warned about them in advance. It chose targets that were not really the most serious ones. It could have done otherwise. It chose not to. But it wanted to show that we can do this and that. We choose not to do so. Please listen to this. Draw the right conclusion. We don't want to have war. We hope that you don't want either. But when you have these so-called ironclad ties, it did no longer happen without US bases in Israel. And who actually intercepted those missiles? It was not just Israel. It was the United States in cooperation with France, UK. Intelligence was being used, channeled, and there were quite a few other countries involved. Very different from, say, Six-Day War, when Israel was relying on French arms, but not on French armament shipments, and stood on its own. Now it's dependent on others. And I think it's very important to understand the strengths and the limitations of this kind of sovereignty. If there was a different government, the conclusions might be different. But with this government, I'm concerned that they may think that we have to support those American objectives and interests that want to destabilize Iran. Americans want to do it perhaps because there's great untapped resources in Iran. Israel wants to do it with by its own reasons that have less to do with those resources. They wouldn't get them anyways. But they think that that would give them permanent security. It won't. It will just destabilize the area again. And we've seen in the Middle East time and time again what happens with destabilization. It never advances the cause of peace. And I think that most Israelis are fed up with war, but they don't find parliamentary venues to express that. That's why they are in the streets.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dan, for being with us today. Great pleasure as always.
Thank you.